You know that sweet feeling when a bully finally gets what's coming to them? This story isn't just about a greedy HOA trying to destroy something sacred. It's about what happens when you mess with Mother Nature. I'm Jackson Avery, and for 15 years I lived peacefully on my Hawaiian wetlands until they decided to build 72 luxury cabins right on top of it. They thought money could buy everything, but they forgot one thing you can't buy: Mother Nature. When she gets angry, she doesn't send lawyers. She sends hurricanes. Stick around to see how nature takes its revenge. Comment below where you're watching from. I should probably start by telling you about my sanctuary before it all went to hell. For 15 years, I'd been living on this beautiful piece of Hawaiian wetlands, watching the sunrise paint the water every single morning like some kind of natural masterpiece. I'm 60 years old now, retired from my job as an ecological specialist, and honestly, I thought I'd found my perfect ending. Every morning, I walked through the wetlands checking on the birds. I had grown to love the water levels and the plants that were becoming part of me. This wasn't just my home, it was part of my soul. I'm naturally a peaceful guy, but when someone pushes me, well, let's just say I can be pretty stubborn. The sounds of water and birds were my only company, a quiet reminder of the life I had built here. My peaceful routine shattered the moment Brianna Sterling stepped onto my land, her presence marking the beginning of something far worse. Picture this: a 55-year-old woman in designer clothes and oversized sunglasses marching onto my property like she owned the place. Her expensive heels kept sinking into the soft wetland soil, and I could see her getting more annoyed with every step. Brianna was our HOA president, the type of person who would call the police on kids selling lemonade without permits. She had this way of looking at you like you were something stuck to the bottom of her shoe, and her perfectly manicured nails were always tapping impatiently against whatever surface was nearest. She stood there, eyes scanning every inch of the land with a strange intensity. It felt like more than just an evaluation. It was as if she already knew something I didn't. "Mr. Avery," she said, surveying what she probably saw as my mess. "This wild jungle is dragging down our entire neighborhood's appeal. We have exciting development opportunities that could benefit everyone." I looked around at my carefully maintained ecosystem, and my fingers curled into fists. Something about her tone made my stomach churn. This is an ecosystem that took decades to establish, Brianna, not a jungle. Her smile was colder than a January morning in Alaska. "Whatever you call it, change is coming, whether you participate or not." The way she emphasized weather made it clear this wasn't a request or even a discussion. This was a declaration of war. Her smile didn't reach her eyes as she turned away. "You'll regret this, Mr. Avery. I always get what I want one way or another." I stood there, heart pounding, wondering how much she knew already. Looking back, I should have known right then that she wasn't just making conversation. There was something in her voice, this absolute certainty that made my skin crawl. But honestly, I was still thinking like a reasonable person dealing with another reasonable person. Boy, was I wrong about that. She mentioned these development opportunities like it was already a done deal before any community discussion had even happened. That should have been my first red flag, but I guess I was still giving her the benefit of the doubt. I mean, who plans to destroy protected wetlands without at least pretending to get input from the community first? The whole conversation lasted maybe 10 minutes, but she spent most of it taking photos with her phone, measuring distances with her eyes, and making notes in some kind of leather-bound planner. It felt less like a neighborly visit and more like a surveyor preparing for demolition. When she finally left, her heels clicking against the wooden walkway I'd built to minimize impact on the wetland soil, I had this sinking feeling that my quiet life was about to become very complicated. The real ambush came a week later at what Brianna called an emergency HOA gathering at the community center. I walked in expecting maybe a discussion about pool maintenance or parking violations. Instead, I found myself staring at this professional presentation about something called Tropical Paradise Resort. 72 luxury vacation cabins with resort amenities, all positioned directly over my wetlands. The whole thing was laid out like it was already approved, complete with architectural drawings and financing projections. She had topographical maps, environmental impact assessments that looked suspiciously brief, and even marketing materials showing happy families enjoying their waterfront vacation rentals. Brianna stood up there like some kind of corporate CEO, talking about community enhancement powers and threatening property seizure if anyone obstructed progress. I felt the heat rising in my chest as the scope of her scheme became clear. You're talking about destroying a protected ecosystem for vacation rentals, I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. That cold smile of hers got even wider. Progress demands difficult choices, Mr. Avery. Smart people adapt. The presentation continued for another 20 minutes, with charts showing projected property value increases and profit-sharing arrangements for cooperative neighbors. I sat there in stunned silence, watching my community get seduced by dollar signs. The worst part wasn't even Brianna's arrogance. It was watching my neighbors' faces light up with excitement as she talked about property values and profit sharing. These were people I'd lived next to for over a decade, people who used to compliment my morning birdwatching routine and ask about the different species they'd see from their kitchen windows. Now they were looking at me like I was the problem, like I was standing in the way of their financial windfall. Mrs. Henderson, who had always loved watching the herons from her back porch, was nodding enthusiastically about the improved water access the development would provide. Jim Rodriguez, who used to joke about being jealous of my peaceful mornings, was asking detailed questions about construction timelines and rental income potential. The room buzzed with excitement, while I sat there feeling like I was watching my world crumble in real time. When the presentation ended and people started filing out, chattering excitedly about their upcoming windfall, I overheard fragments of conversation that made my heart sink. "Finally, something useful with that swamp," one neighbor said. "About time someone did something productive with Avery's bird sanctuary," said another. Walking home that night, past herons feeding quietly in the moonlit shallows, I felt the weight of an impossible fight ahead. She thought she could steamroll over me and Mother Nature. But was I really strong enough to fight both an HOA and the entire system backing them? That question kept me awake all night, staring at the ceiling and wondering if I was about to become the neighborhood crazy person fighting a battle I couldn't possibly win. Days blurred together as I dug deeper into the legal mess. But then a footnote caught my eye, the loophole I needed. I'd spent days drowning in legal jargon, feeling like I was sinking. But then, buried in a footnote, I found it, the loophole that could change everything. The question now was, could I pull this off? The Hawaii Wetlands Protection Act from 1980 was crystal clear about one thing that Brianna had apparently overlooked. Any construction on designated sensitive wetlands required comprehensive environmental review and federal permits. Not local permits, not HOA approval, federal permits. The documentation requirements were extensive soil composition analysis, water flow studies, wildlife impact assessments, and federal agency approval processes that typically took months or even years to complete. Reading through the legal requirements, I realized Brianna's aggressive timeline was completely unrealistic if she planned to follow the law, which, based on her presentation, she clearly didn't. I spent the next few hours drafting an email to a well-known environmental lawyer, Lena Davis. If I was going to fight, I needed professional help. My gut told me Brianna wasn't playing by the rules, and I wasn't going down without a fight. Lena was sharp. She cut through the jargon in seconds. "This is what we need, but we need to move fast." She had this way of cutting through legal jargon and explaining things in plain English that made sense, which was refreshing after days of drowning in regulatory language. When she reviewed my findings, her reaction was better than I dared to hope. "Your property qualifies for the highest level of federal protection, Jackson. They can't break ground without extensive permitting." The relief I felt was incredible, like finally finding solid ground after weeks of quicksand. But Lena's next words brought me right back to reality. Of course, that doesn't mean they won't try. People like Brianna don't usually let little things like federal law slow them down. She explained that environmental protections were only as strong as the enforcement behind them, and enforcement often depended on having someone willing to fight. "The question is," she said, leaning back in her chair and studying me carefully, "how far are you willing to go to protect this land?" I looked out of her office window at the bustling city beyond and thought about the quiet mornings on my wetlands. "As far as it takes," I told her, and meant every word. She was right about that. Within 48 hours of my legal filing, the intimidation campaign began in earnest. Mark Thompson, the HOA's hired legal muscle, started flooding my mailbox with threats about obstructing legitimate community improvements and tortious interference with development tool tracks. This guy was straight out of Central Casting, for corporate villain $1,000 suit shark eyes and the kind of smile that made you want to count your fingers after shaking hands. His letters were masterpieces of legal intimidation, carefully worded to sound official and threatening without crossing the line into actual harassment. But the really creative stuff started happening to my utilities and property taxes. My property tax assessment mysteriously quadrupled overnight with vague references to improved land valuation based on development potential. Suddenly, the utility company discovered urgent infrastructure issues that required rolling blackouts affecting only my street. My internet service became unreliable. My mail delivery got sporadic, and I started getting visits from various city inspectors looking for code violations. The message was clear: cooperate or face death by 1,000 bureaucratic cuts. I wasn't sure if I was being paranoid, but when your property taxes jump from $800 to $3,200 in a single assessment cycle, paranoia starts looking like reasonable caution. Armed with the wetlands protection laws, I filed a comprehensive legal objection that apparently caught them completely off guard. The county planning board was forced to suspend all HOA permits for a mandatory 60-day environmental review. I celebrated that night at home with herbal tea, watching egrets hunt in the shallow waters that Brianna wanted to pave over, feeling like maybe David could actually beat Goliath after all. For the first time in weeks, I slept peacefully, thinking I'd found the silver bullet that would end this whole nightmare. Looking back now, I can't believe how naive I was. I should have known that people willing to destroy protected wetlands for profit wouldn't be stopped by something as inconvenient as the law. The victory felt so clean and simple. Bad guys try to break environmental law. Good guy stops them with legal system. Everyone goes home happy. If only real life worked like that. The 60-day review period gave me time to breathe and plan, but it also gave Brianna and her team time to regroup and escalate their tactics. I spent those weeks documenting everything, photographing the wildlife, recording the sounds of the wetlands, and building what I thought would be an unassailable case for preservation. I was preparing for a legal battle, not realizing that my opponents had already decided the legal system was optional. My victory celebration came to an abrupt end when I stumbled across some suspicious financial records in a public database. I wasn't even looking for corruption evidence, just trying to understand the permitting process better, and maybe find other cases where similar developments had been challenged. But there it was, clear as day. The county commissioner who'd been overseeing our case had received substantial consulting fees from a shell company that traced directly back to the HOA Development Fund. $25,000 in payments over the past 6 months, all documented in public filings that no one apparently expected anyone to actually read. The corruption ran deeper than I'd imagined. They weren't just planning to steal my land. They had already bought the system to do it. I printed out everything, cross-referenced the payments with key decisions affecting our area, and built a timeline that showed exactly how the fix was in. I stared at those financial records until my eyes burned trying to process what this meant. I filed the paperwork, but something about it didn't sit right. The storm was coming, but it wasn't the weather I had to worry about. I wasn't looking for a bombshell, but what I found hit me like a truck. The commissioner had been paid off. The more I dug, the clearer it became. Brianna wasn't just breaking laws. She was orchestrating a full-scale conspiracy. I needed to get ahead of this fast. Despite having overwhelming evidence of bribery that should have ended careers and started criminal investigations, I watched the county commissioners rubber stamp the HOA's environmental exemption after a 15-minute closed-door session. 15 minutes. That's how long it took to overturn decades of environmental protection law and dismiss my carefully documented legal objection. When the decision came down, I couldn't hold back. "This is corrupt," I yelled. But no one flinched, just cold stares all around. The public hearing that followed was a masterclass in bureaucratic theater, with commissioners nodding seriously, while completely ignoring every point I raised about federal law violations and wetland protection requirements. My corruption complaint vanished into what felt like a bureaucratic black hole at the state level, and every phone call to oversight agencies resulted in endless transfers and voicemail systems that seemed designed to make people give up. I wasn't sure if I was losing my mind or if the entire system was actually this broken. Turns out it was the latter, but realizing that didn't make me feel any better about my chances. The state environmental office assured me my complaint was under review and would be addressed in due course, which I learned was bureaucrat speak for, "We're hoping you'll get tired and go away." Each agency I contacted referred me to another agency, creating an endless loop of responsibility avoidance that would have been impressive if it hadn't been destroying my faith in government. Things escalated from bureaucratic frustration to personal warfare when a sheriff's deputy showed up at my front door, escorting Brianna like she was conducting some kind of official business. She handed me an emergency structural violations notice that was so obviously fabricated, it would have been funny if it hadn't been targeting my home. $25,000 in mandatory repairs within 30 days, or face home demolition. The violations included things like improper wetland drainage and non-compliant natural landscaping. I actually had to read it twice because I couldn't believe someone had put those words together in an official document. They were literally citing me for not destroying the wetlands fast enough to suit their development plans. When I looked up from the paper, Brianna's mask had completely dropped. Brianna's smile faded, and her voice turned to steel. "You're making a mistake, Jackson. Stop now or I'll make sure you regret it." Something in her tone triggered 15 years of protective instincts I'd developed for this ecosystem. 15 years protecting this land taught me patience, Brianna. You're about to learn what that means. The deputy looked uncomfortable during this exchange, like he knew he was being used to intimidate a law-abiding citizen, but couldn't figure out how to extract himself from the situation. After they left, I stood on my front porch, looking out at the wetlands, and realized I was no longer fighting just for the environment. I was fighting for the principle that money shouldn't be able to buy immunity from the law. Lena's eyes went wide when I showed her the documents. "This goes higher than I thought. You're not just fighting an HOA, you're fighting an entire system." An anonymous leak a few days later revealed the true scope of Brianna's operation, and honestly, it was more comprehensive than anything I'd imagined. She'd recruited fake supporters to pack public hearings with scripted testimonials that sounded like they'd been written by the same marketing firm. Community members who'd never shown interest in local politics suddenly appeared at every meeting with identical talking points about economic development and job creation. She'd manufactured community petitions using names from cemetery records, which was both illegal and creepy, in ways I'm still processing. Most disturbing of all, she'd pre-purchased building inspector approvals before construction had even been proposed, let alone reviewed. This wasn't development, it was systematic fraud designed to bypass every environmental protection we'd built over decades. The level of planning and corruption required was staggering, and it made me wonder how many other communities had been steamrolled by similar schemes. The anonymous source who leaked this information turned out to be someone inside the HOA organization who'd grown disgusted with what they were witnessing. They couldn't come forward publicly without destroying their career, but they could make sure the truth reached someone willing to fight. The documents they provided showed a conspiracy that reached into county government, state environmental agencies, and even federal oversight offices where key personnel had been targeted for recruitment or intimidation. The deeper I went, the more disgusted I became. This wasn't just a legal battle anymore. It was personal. Brianna had stolen more than my land. She was trying to erase everything I stood for. The isolation campaign that followed was almost worse than the legal threats. Neighbors who'd waved at me for years started crossing streets to avoid me after the HOA spread whispers about my extremist environmental activism, destroying property values. Former friends were suddenly too busy to return my calls, and local businesses started treating me like I had some kind of contagious disease. I went from being a respected community member to a pariah in less than 2 weeks. There were moments when I wondered if maybe I was being too stubborn, if maybe I should just take whatever buyout they were offering and move somewhere else where people appreciated environmental protection, instead of seeing it as an obstacle to profit. But then I'd look out at the herons and egrets going about their daily routines, completely unaware that their entire world was about to be destroyed for vacation rentals, and my resolve would harden again. These creatures had no voice in the political process, no ability to hire lawyers or file appeals or speak at public hearings. If I didn't stand up for them, who would? The irony wasn't lost on me that in a community that prided itself on environmental consciousness and sustainability, I was being ostracized for actually trying to protect the environment. It turns out most people's environmental commitment doesn't extend much beyond recycling bins and reusable shopping bags when there's serious money on the table. With the legal system completely compromised and my community turning against me, I shifted tactics entirely. I started conducting covert intelligence gathering while researching historical weather patterns for our coastal region. That's when I discovered something that changed everything, a 1962 University of Hawaii study buried deep in academic archives. These wetlands didn't just support wildlife. They functioned as a critical hurricane surge buffer, protecting inland communities from catastrophic flooding. The study included detailed modeling of storm surge patterns, showing how intact wetlands could absorb and disperse the energy of major hurricanes, reducing inland flooding by up to 70%. The implications were staggering. Brianna wasn't just destroying an ecosystem, she was removing the natural protection that kept our entire area from being wiped out during major storms. The study had been commissioned after Hurricane Dot devastated the islands in 1959, but apparently its findings had been forgotten as waterfront property became too valuable to leave in its natural state. They'd corrupted judges, bought inspectors, and turned my neighbors against me. But there was one thing money couldn't buy: control over hurricane season. The question that kept me awake at night was whether I'd really be desperate enough to bet everything on Mother Nature's timing. Looking back now, I think some part of me already knew the answer. Just when I thought I had the upper hand, Lena dropped a bombshell. "The commissioner, he's been paid off. You've just become a target." I set up my cameras carefully, but the moment I caught them dumping chemicals, I realized I wasn't the only one watching. One of the workers caught my eye, and I froze. Each morning I set up new cameras, and every night I reviewed the footage. As I pieced together the evidence, the pattern became clear. They were hiding something, and I was about to expose it. I transformed myself into an investigative journalist, using hidden cameras and audio equipment to capture environmental violations in real time. Early morning surveillance revealed workers dumping concrete waste directly into protected wetland channels, which was so blatantly illegal, I had to watch the footage twice to make sure I wasn't seeing things. The construction crew wasn't even trying to hide their violations. They were operating like environmental laws didn't apply to them, which, given the level of corruption I'd uncovered, might have been exactly what they'd been told. During lunch breaks, I interviewed construction crew members who were surprisingly willing to talk once they realized I wasn't there to get them in trouble. What they told me made my blood run cold. These weren't just corner-cutting shortcuts. This was systematic fraud designed to maximize profits while creating structures that wouldn't survive a strong thunderstorm, let alone a hurricane. The workers knew they were building death traps, but they needed the jobs and had been assured that everything was taken care of at the regulatory level. One electrician confided that he'd never worked on a project with so many code violations, but every time he raised concerns, he was told that special permits had been obtained and normal rules didn't apply. I watched from a distance as the workers dumped hazardous waste into the wetlands. Just as I was about to take a closer shot, one of them looked up. For a moment, our eyes locked, but I quickly ducked behind the trees. The crew foreman confided during a smoke break that management had ordered 18-foot pilings instead of the required 30-foot depth. "Save them $40,000 per cabin," he said, shaking his head. "But these things won't survive a bad thunderstorm, let alone a hurricane." I asked him why he was telling me this, and his answer stuck with me. "Because I've got kids and they live inland from here. If these wetlands get paved over and a big storm hits, the flooding's going to be catastrophic." My hands trembled as I filmed their every move. I had to stay calm, but each time I saw them pollute the wetlands, my blood boiled. They were ruining everything, and I was going to make them pay. The evidence I compiled was damning substandard concrete mixture, failing basic strength tests, sewage systems designed to discharge directly into wetlands during heavy rains, safety protocols abandoned to meet artificial deadlines, and building materials switched to the cheapest alternatives after inspection approvals. Every single cabin was essentially a death trap built on lies. The foreman showed me internal memos detailing the cost-cutting measures, including instructions to use concrete that was 30% weaker than building codes required, and foundation work that ignored soil composition studies showing the ground couldn't support the planned structures. They were literally building on sand and calling it bedrock. I documented everything, creating a comprehensive record of every violation, every shortcut, and every moment when profit was prioritized over safety and environmental protection. The final eviction notice arrived with armed sheriff's deputies giving me 48 hours to vacate or face arrest for creating a public safety hazard through illegal occupancy. Sitting in my empty house that night, watching bulldozers devour the wetlands where endangered birds had nested for decades, I faced my darkest moment. Maybe I should have just walked away. I don't know. Part of me wondered if I was being stubborn to the point of stupidity. Was I really willing to risk everything, including my freedom, for a piece of land that most people saw as worthless swamp? But then the National Hurricane Center issued the first tropical storm watch of the season, and something inside me shifted. Kalani was forming rapidly in the Pacific, tracking toward the Hawaiian archipelago with unusual intensity for this time of year. The timing felt like more than coincidence. It felt like the universe was presenting me with an opportunity to prove my point in the most dramatic way possible. Would you risk your life to prove a point about environmental protection? Most people would call that crazy, but sitting there surrounded by decades of research about hurricane patterns and wetland protection, I realized I might be witnessing the setup for the ultimate vindication. I dove into historical meteorological data and discovered a chilling pattern that made everything click into place. Major hurricanes struck this region every 15 to 20 years, and the last major storm had been in 1996. We were overdue, and Kalani was intensifying faster than anyone had predicted. The storm was following the exact track that the 1962 study had identified as most dangerous for our area, the path that would generate maximum storm surge right where Brianna's cabins were being built. I created a comprehensive evidence archive with dead man switch programming that would automatically upload everything to federal agencies, major news networks, and viral distribution channels if my internet or power was cut for more than 6 hours. It felt like preparing for war, which I guess in a way it was. The archive included everything: the corruption evidence, the construction violations, the environmental impact data, and the historical studies showing why wetland destruction would lead to catastrophic flooding. If something happened to me during the storm, at least the truth would survive to hold the guilty parties accountable. The site supervisor approached me privately as I was setting up my final surveillance equipment. "Those cabins are death traps, sir. Foundation work's completely inadequate. Management knows it, but they're rushing to sell units before anyone notices." His words confirmed what I'd suspected. They knew the structures wouldn't survive a major storm, but they were gambling that they could sell out before hurricane season arrived and make the buyers' insurance companies deal with the aftermath. The cynicism was breathtaking. They were willing to sell vacation homes to families knowing those homes would likely be destroyed in the first major storm, just to maximize their short-term profits. The supervisor handed me a flash drive containing internal communications about the construction shortcuts, insurance fraud planning, and post-disaster liability avoidance strategies. "I can't go public with this," he said, "but someone needs to know what's really happening here." Brianna's smile faded, and her voice turned to steel. "You're making a mistake, Jackson. Stop now or I'll make sure you regret it. If someone had destroyed everything you loved, and the system had completely failed, would you run away or stand your ground?" I already knew my answer. 72 luxury cabins built on lies and cheap concrete were about to face Mother Nature's final inspection. The question wasn't whether I was brave enough or foolish enough to stay and watch. The question was whether I was ready to document the most spectacular display of natural justice in recorded history. Just as I was about to send the evidence to the authorities, my phone rang. "We know what you're doing. Stop now, or things will get worse." I froze, the weight of their threat sinking in. I checked the backup systems again, my hands shaking. If Kalani hit at full force, all my work could be gone in an instant. The storm was coming, but I didn't have time to watch satellite data anymore. My focus had shifted. I had to prepare for something far more dangerous. I double-checked my backup systems, knowing I might never be able to use them if the storm hit at full force. The eviction deadline loomed while Hurricane Kalani strengthened offshore, and I found myself caught in an internal battle between self-preservation and stubborn principle that reached crisis point around midnight every night. During the day, I could convince myself I was doing the right thing, documenting this historic confrontation between human greed and natural forces. But in the dark hours before dawn, doubt crept in like floodwater. I kept asking myself, was I risking everything for a cause, or was I just too stubborn to back down? The rational part of my mind kept pointing out that I was 60 years old, alone, and about to face down a Category 4 hurricane, just to prove that a corrupt HOA had built substandard vacation rentals on protected wetlands. When I put it like that, it sounded completely insane. But then morning would come, and I'd watch the displaced wildlife searching desperately for shelter as their habitat disappeared under concrete and bulldozers, and my resolve would harden again. The moment of clarity came while watching a displaced heron family searching desperately for a nesting site in the construction zone. These creatures had depended on this ecosystem for generations, and they had no voice in Brianna's profit calculations. Someone had to speak for them, even if that someone was a 60-year-old man who was probably about to make the biggest mistake of his life. Kalani underwent explosive strengthening that defied every meteorological model, jumping from Category 1 to Category 3 in just 18 hours. The National Weather Service was issuing increasingly urgent warnings about unprecedented rapid intensification, the kind of storm behavior that climate scientists had been predicting but hoping wouldn't happen so soon. Emergency management issued mandatory coastal evacuation orders for all structures without hurricane-rated foundations, which should have included every single one of Brianna's cabins. I measured the foundation depths personally using equipment I'd borrowed from a sympathetic construction worker, 18 feet deep, in what the Weather Service was calling a 30-foot hurricane zone. Catastrophic failure was mathematically guaranteed under major storm conditions. The question wasn't whether the cabins would survive. The question was how spectacular their destruction would be, and whether I'd live to document it. I wasn't just watching the storm anymore, I was preparing for war. I called Lena and told her we needed to act quickly. This wasn't just about the wetlands anymore, this was survival. My complete digital evidence dossier included scientific analysis, proving the wetlands' storm surge protection function. Time-stamped video of every construction code, violation audio, confessions from workers about safety shortcuts, and Weather Service storm surge predictions, overlaid with precise construction site elevations. The automated distribution system was programmed to release everything if communications were lost for more than 6 hours. I'd spent 3 days programming backup systems, and redundant triggers determined that the truth would survive, even if I didn't. Looking back, I'm still not sure if that was preparation or paranoia, but given what happened next, I'm glad I erred on the side of overkill. The system included satellite uplinks, cellular backups, and even ham radio transmission capabilities that would broadcast my evidence archive across multiple networks simultaneously. I was essentially creating a digital time bomb that would explode with corruption evidence the moment Kalani knocked out the power grid. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was using technology to document humanity's failure to respect natural systems that had protected this coast for thousands of years. The most damning evidence surfaced almost by accident when I was organizing files for the automated system. The HOA had never filed the required federal wetland permits. Not delayed filing, not incomplete paperwork, not bureaucratic oversight. They'd simply ignored federal law entirely. This meant the entire construction project violated the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, and the National Environmental Policy Act simultaneously. We weren't talking about local zoning disputes anymore. This was federal criminal conspiracy, punishable by decades in prison. I actually had to sit down and stare at the screen for a few minutes, trying to process the sheer audacity of what they'd attempted. They'd built an entire luxury resort on federally protected land, without even pretending to follow environmental law, apparently confident that their web of local corruption would protect them from federal oversight. The documents showed they'd actively avoided applying for federal permits specifically because they knew the project would never be approved under legitimate environmental review. Instead, they'd simply forged local approval documents and hoped federal agencies wouldn't notice until after construction was complete and legal challenges became too expensive to pursue. Despite mandatory evacuation orders and personal safety risks that kept growing by the hour, I chose to witness nature's response to human arrogance firsthand. My house was fortified with hurricane shutters and stocked with emergency supplies, all devices charged for documentation duty. The storm shutters were rated for Category 5 conditions, installed after Hurricane Iniki back in 1992, when I first moved to the islands and learned to respect the ocean's power. Emergency supplies included enough food and water for 2 weeks backup power systems and communication equipment that would keep working even if every cell tower in the area went down. Kalani was now a Category 4 monster, making direct landfall in 18 hours, and 72 luxury cabins were about to face nature's final exam. The Weather Service was predicting storm surge heights of 25 to 30 feet, exactly the scenario that the 1962 Wetlands study had identified as catastrophic for developments built in the flood zone. Doubt crept in. The storm was bigger than anything I'd ever faced. But as I stood there looking out at the wetlands, I knew one thing for certain: I wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. I kept asking myself that question right up until the first storm bands arrived. Was I about to witness the greatest vindication of my life, or become the biggest fool who ever lived? Either way, I was going to document every second of it, creating a historical record of what happens when human arrogance meets unstoppable natural forces. Would you risk your life to prove a point? I kept asking myself that question as I watched Kalani's satellite imagery showing a perfectly organized storm with a clearly defined eye wall, the kind of textbook hurricane that meteorologists both admire and fear. As I watched the storm gather strength, I realized it wasn't just a test for the wetlands, it was a test for me. Could I survive this? The wind howled and I knew the worst was yet to come. The hurricane's eye was on us. The winds howled louder than I'd ever imagined, tearing through the trees. But it wasn't just the storm that had me on edge, it was the waiting, the fear of what was coming next. Kalani struck our coastline as a Category 4 monster, with sustained winds hitting 140 miles per hour, and the sound was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It wasn't just wind, it was like the ocean had declared war on the land and brought its entire arsenal. The howling was so intense, it seemed to penetrate right through the hurricane shutters and into my bones, a constant roar that made normal thought almost impossible. The 25-foot storm surge that followed was a wall of dark water racing inland with unstoppable momentum, carrying everything in its path, from boats to cars to pieces of buildings that had been torn apart by the wind. Where intact wetlands once absorbed and gradually dispersed storm energy over miles of natural channels and vegetation, the flat construction site offered zero resistance to the oceanic fury. I grabbed my camera, but as the floodwaters rose, I realized the real fight wasn't just documenting the storm, it was surviving it. The surge came in fast, and I barely made it upstairs before the water hit. I watched from my reinforced second floor as the surge hit the cabin development like a liquid freight train, and what happened next was both terrifying and oddly satisfying. The water didn't just flood the construction site, it completely overwhelmed it, turning what had been a luxury resort into an underwater demolition zone in a matter of minutes. The cabins didn't just collapse, they shattered. Walls buckled and roofs tore away in a spectacular violent display. The water rushed in, swallowing them whole as the wind screamed through the debris. Watching the destruction felt like the storm had finally washed away the lies. Justice had arrived. The inadequate 18-foot foundation snapped under 25-foot surge pressure like toothpicks in a blender. 72 luxury cabins disintegrated, sequentially falling like dominoes in slow motion, as each structure's failure destabilized the next. The cheap concrete that was supposed to last decades dissolved in salt water within hours, releasing toxic construction chemicals into the churning floodwater in clouds of brown and gray that spread across the entire area like industrial pollution. Entire cabins were swept seaward, floating past my windows like oversized toys in a bathtub, their walls collapsing and roofs tearing off as they tumbled in the current. I captured everything through stormproof cameras, though the wind noise made audio recording impossible. The visual evidence spoke volumes about what happens when engineering hubris meets unstoppable natural forces. Furniture, appliances, construction equipment, and even completed sections of buildings rolled past in the surge like debris from some massive disaster movie. Except this was real and happening right outside my window. The destruction was so complete and so rapid that within 3 hours there was almost no evidence that a $15 million resort had ever existed on that site. My power grid failed after 4 hours of sustained hurricane conditions, which triggered the automatic evidence release system I had programmed. Within minutes of upload, HOA, Hurricane Karma, exploded across social platforms with the kind of viral velocity that marketing companies spend millions trying to achieve. News networks picked up the story immediately, with major outlets leading with headlines like "Environmental Fraud Exposed by Hurricane" and "Wetlands Protection Vindicated by Storm." And the timing was perfect in the most horrible way possible. Here was real-time footage of environmental destruction causing exactly the catastrophic flooding that the original wetland studies had predicted decades earlier. The story spread faster than the hurricane itself, with millions of people sharing footage of luxury cabins dissolving in storm surge, while my narrator's commentary explained the corruption and environmental law violations that had made the disaster inevitable. Environmental groups worldwide seized on the story as the perfect example of why ecosystem protection matters, while legal experts began analyzing the federal crimes that had been documented in real time. The viral hashtags wrote themselves: Nature's Revenge, Hurricane Justice, Wetlands Vindication, and Environmental Karma, all trending simultaneously across every platform. My home, built to proper hurricane specifications, on elevated ground with respect for natural drainage patterns, sustained only cosmetic roof damage, while everything around me was being rearranged by forces beyond human control. The remaining wetland strips behind my property successfully channeled floodwater away from inland neighborhoods, exactly as the 1962 study had predicted they would. Watching that natural system work perfectly, while Brianna's luxury development dissolved into component molecules, was vindication on a scale I'd never imagined possible. I wasn't just right about the environmental protection. I was witnessing a real-time demonstration of why these laws existed in the first place. The contrast was stark and undeniable. Natural wetlands protecting human communities while artificial development created catastrophic flooding. Every environmental scientist who had ever argued for wetland protection now had the perfect case study filmed in high definition during an actual hurricane. The footage showed water flowing smoothly through natural channels around my property while creating massive destructive currents. Where the resort had been built, a side-by-side comparison that no amount of corporate spin could explain away. As dawn broke over the wreckage, the devastation was unimaginable, and my heart sank. Everything I fought for, gone. Where a $15 million luxury resort had stood 12 hours earlier, empty ocean stretched to the horizon littered with construction debris and personal belongings that would probably wash ashore on distant islands for months to come. The financial damage assessment was swift and brutal: complete construction losses with zero insurance coverage due to fraudulent permitting. Every cabin buyer would be filing lawsuits, every investor would be demanding explanations, and every regulatory agency would be asking questions that Brianna had no good answers for. The cleanup costs alone would run into tens of millions, and that was before considering the environmental remediation required to remove construction chemicals from the marine ecosystem. Standing waist-deep in muddy water, where her luxury resort used to be, holding a soggy piece of designer furniture that had somehow survived the storm, Brianna looked like she was finally understanding that Mother Nature had sent her an invoice marked "payment overdue." But would anyone actually pay the price, or would they find another way to escape justice? I watched as the floodwaters tore through the construction site, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something even worse was coming. I turned to check the backup system, but the lights flickered and went out. I was in the dark, both literally and figuratively. The storm had passed, but the devastation was everywhere. The cabins were gone, but so was something bigger: my faith in the system. I had won, but at what cost? Nature had claimed her victory, but there was no joy in it, only the bitter taste of justice. HOA, Hurricane Karma, exploded online, becoming a global sensation as environmental groups used the footage to highlight why ecosystem protection matters. Major networks scrambled for interviews, while the story spread like wildfire, proving people love seeing justice served. I went from neighborhood pariah to environmental folk hero overnight, which was surreal but also deeply satisfying after months of being treated like a crazy person for trying to protect federally protected wetlands. The interviews were interesting because everyone wanted to know if I'd planned for the hurricane to hit, as if I'd somehow conspired with Mother Nature to time everything perfectly. Documentary filmmakers started calling within hours, wanting to turn the story into everything from feature films to educational content about environmental protection and government corruption. The irony wasn't lost on me that the same neighbors who'd crossed the street to avoid me were now proudly telling reporters they'd always supported my environmental activism. Within 72 hours, the FBI arrested Brianna and Mark for fraud, bribery, and environmental crimes. Federal prosecutors had been building cases against both of them for months based on my corruption evidence, but the hurricane footage provided the perfect catalyst for immediate action. The federal prosecutor presented my evidence package to a jury that watched hurricane footage showing luxury cabins dissolving like sugar cubes in salt water, while listening to audio recordings of construction workers admitting they knew the buildings were death traps. Brianna's defense team tried arguing that the hurricane was an act of God, that no one could have predicted, but the 1962 Wetlands study and my documented warnings made that argument look ridiculous. The judge delivered a scathing verdict about unconscionable disregard for environmental laws and public safety in pursuit of personal profit, noting that the defendants had actively ignored scientific evidence about hurricane risks while building structures they knew would fail in major storms. The trial became a media sensation, with courtroom footage showing Brianna's transformation from arrogant HOA queen to federal defendant facing decades in prison. Brianna Sterling received 20 years in federal prison plus $15 million in restitution payments, while Mark Thompson got 15 years plus permanent disbarment from practicing law. The county commissioners who'd accepted bribes received sentences ranging from 5 to 10 years each, depending on how much they'd taken and how cooperative they were with investigators. Watching these sentences get handed down felt like witnessing a masterclass in delayed justice, the kind of comprehensive accountability that rarely happens in white-collar crime cases. Insurance companies unanimously denied all claims due to fraudulent permits and code violations, leaving the 72 cabin buyers to file a massive class action lawsuit seeking triple damages from everyone involved in the conspiracy. The financial cascade was swift and comprehensive. Brianna's million-dollar mansion was auctioned for victim compensation. Her luxury vehicle collection liquidated, even her designer wardrobe and jewelry sold at government surplus auctions. Mark Thompson's law practice dissolved overnight, with client funds seized to pay legal penalties and his professional reputation destroyed so thoroughly that he couldn't find work as a paralegal. The corruption network that had seemed so powerful just months earlier crumbled completely once federal investigators started following the money trail my evidence had provided. As Brianna's fate was sealed, I couldn't help but think about what this victory really meant. Sure, I had taken down the corrupt HOA president, but what about the others? What about the land I fought for? Could anything ever truly restore what was lost? The Hawaii Department of Natural Resources granted my wetlands permanent protection status, with federal preservation funding and restoration work began immediately, with marine biology teams documenting the recovery process. Within 1 month, construction debris removal was completed, and native plant species were naturally recolonizing the cleared areas where Brianna's resort had briefly existed. By month 3, rare bird species were returning in unprecedented numbers, apparently attracted by the expanded habitat that resulted from removing artificial barriers to water flow. By month 6, the wetland absorption capacity had been restored to historical levels, with water quality measurements showing complete recovery from construction contamination. Watching that ecosystem heal itself once human interference stopped was more satisfying than any legal victory could have been. Marine biologists described it as one of the fastest natural recoveries they'd ever documented, proof that wetland ecosystems are incredibly resilient when given the chance to restore themselves. All the fraudulent property violations against my home were dismissed with a formal county apology, and I received a permanent tax exemption for environmental stewardship services that officially recognized my role in protecting critical coastal infrastructure. As the wetlands slowly began to heal, I stood there watching the egrets return. But it wasn't just the land that had changed. I had too. The battle wasn't over, but now at least I knew what it was worth fighting for. My morning walks resumed through recovering wetlands where construction noise had once dominated the soundscape. Crystal clear water replaced toxic runoff native vegetation, reclaimed former bulldozer tracks, and the daily wildlife census grew longer every week. Brianna's transformation from entitled HOA queen to federal inmate provided the kind of poetic justice that makes you believe the universe occasionally gets its math right. Weekly news updates showed her failed appeals and adjustment struggles to prison routine, while weekly nature walks showed endangered species thought locally extinct beginning to nest again in areas that had been bulldozed just months earlier. $15 million in total losses, complete personal bankruptcy for all conspirators, and the most comprehensive lesson about respecting natural systems ever delivered by Mother Nature herself. The contrast between human justice and natural justice was remarkable. Human courts took months to deliver verdicts, while the hurricane had delivered its verdict in a single night, with the kind of finality that no appeal could overturn. Dawn breaks over the restored wetlands where 72 luxury cabins once stood. Hawaiian stilts nest where concrete mixers roared, and songbirds sing where construction crews violated environmental laws. Brianna thought money could buy anything, permits, decisions, even hurricane protection. Federal prison is teaching her otherwise 20 years at a time, in a cell less comfortable than the cabins she tried to build. The Pacific Ocean repossessed them in under 3 hours, proving physics trumps connections. Maybe the real lesson here is that greed never wins. If you're still here, share your thoughts and hit the thanks button below. Catch you in the next one.
This story might be over, but QA Stories has a whole vault of mayhem waiting. Choose your next rabbit hole wisely.